the morning that changed everything. Thomas Mitchell had survived the beaches of Normandy, the frozen trenches of the Ardennes, and countless battles across Europe during World War II. At 93 years old, his body bore the invisible scars of war, but his spirit remained unbroken. Every Tuesday morning, he made the same journey from his small flat in East London to the local shops on Whitechapel Road. The autumn air was crisp that October morning as Thomas shuffled down the familiar street. His walking stick tapped rhythmically against the pavement, a sound that had become as much a part of the neighborhood as the morning delivery trucks and the chatter of school children. He wore his old brown coat, the same one he had owned for 20 years, and his military beret sat proudly on his gray head. Thomas had no family left. His wife, Margaret, had passed away 5 years earlier, and they never had children. The local shopkeepers had become his extended family, always greeting him with warm smiles and asking about his health. Mrs. Patel at the corner shop saved his favorite newspaper each morning, and young Ahmed at the bakery always had a fresh roll ready for him. As he approached the busy intersection near the underground station, Thomas noticed the crowd was thicker than usual. Commuters rushed past him, their faces buried in phones or newspapers. The morning rush hour was in full swing, and the elderly veteran felt small among the sea of hurrying people. He had just collected his groceries and was making his way back home when it happened. A group of teenagers, probably skipping school, were hanging around the bus stop. They were loud and restless, looking for trouble to break the boredom of their day. When they spotted the old man walking slowly with his shopping bag, they saw an easy target. "Look at the old-timer," one of them called out, his voice dripping with mockery. "Bet he's got some cash in that bag." Thomas tried to ignore them and keep walking, but the teenagers blocked his path. There were 4 of them, all wearing hoodies and sneakers that probably cost more than Thomas spent on food in a month. The leader, a boy who couldn't have been older than 16, stepped directly in front of the veteran. "Where you going, Grandpa?" the teenager sneered. "Don't you know it's dangerous for old people to walk alone around here?" Thomas's hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the anger rising in his chest. He had faced Nazi soldiers and lived to tell about it. These children didn't scare him, but he knew he was no match for their young strength. "Please, I just want to go home," Thomas said quietly, his voice steady despite his racing heart. The teenagers laughed cruelly. One of them, a girl with bright pink hair, reached for his shopping bag. "Let's see what the old man's got," she said, tugging at the handles. Thomas held tight to his bag, which contained not just his groceries, but also his pension money for the week. Without that money, he wouldn't be able to pay for his electricity bill or buy food for the next 7 days. "Give it up, old man," the leader demanded, his voice growing more aggressive. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." But Thomas Mitchell had not survived the war by giving up easily. He pulled the bag closer to his chest and tried to step around them. That's when the leader shoved him hard in the chest. The push sent the frail veteran stumbling backward. His walking stick clattered to the ground as he lost his balance. Time seemed to slow as Thomas fell, his body hitting the concrete pavement with a sickening thud. The shopping bag flew from his hands, scattering its contents across the sidewalk. The teenagers grabbed what they could and ran, disappearing into the crowd like ghosts. Thomas lay on the cold pavement, pain shooting through his hip and back. His beret had fallen off, revealing his thinning white hair. Blood trickled from a cut on his forehead where it had struck the ground. People walked past, some glancing down at the fallen man but not stopping. In the busy rush of London life, an old man on the ground seemed to blend into the urban landscape. Some pulled out their phones, but whether to call for help or to take pictures was unclear. Thomas tried to push himself up, but the pain was too intense. His hip felt like it might be broken, and his vision was blurry from the head injury. He lay there, looking up at the gray October sky, feeling more alone than he had ever felt in his long life. The irony was not lost on him. He had survived bullets and bombs. had seen friends die beside him in foxholes, had crawled through mud and blood to serve his country. And now, at 93, he was defeated by a group of children on a London street corner. As he lay there, Thomas thought about Margaret. She always worried about him going out alone, especially after her death. "Promise me you'll be careful," she had said during her final days in the hospital. "Promise me you'll ask for help if you need it." But who was there to ask? The neighbors barely knew him. The shopkeepers were kind, but they had their own lives and problems. The government had given him a small pension and a medal years ago, but where were they now when he needed them? Minutes passed, though they felt like hours to Thomas. His groceries lay the moment of choice. James Harrison had been a member of the Queen's Guard for 8 years. At 28 years old, he stood 6 feet 2 inches tall and had the disciplined posture that came from years of military training. His red tunic was pressed to perfection, his black boots polished to a mirror shine, and his famous bearskin hat sat precisely as regulations demanded. This Tuesday morning found him stationed outside Buckingham Palace, standing as still as a statue while tourists snapped photos and tried to make him laugh or smile. The Queen's Guard were famous for their unwavering discipline, their ability to stand motionless for hours regardless of weather, distractions, or provocation. James had mastered this skill, becoming almost like a living monument to British tradition. But beneath his stoic exterior, James was fighting an internal battle. His phone, tucked discreetly in his jacket, had been buzzing with notifications for the past hour. A news alert app had sent him updates about incidents happening around London, including one that made his blood run cold. Elderly war veteran assaulted and left injured in East London Street. The brief description mentioned that a 93-year-old World War II veteran had been attacked by teenagers and was lying injured on Whitechapel Road. Paramedics were reportedly delayed due to heavy traffic, and police were still searching for the attackers. James's grandfather had been a World War II veteran as well. Private William Harrison had served in the same regiment that James now honored as a Queen's Guard. Growing up, James had spent countless hours listening to his grandfather's war stories, learning about courage, sacrifice, and the debt that younger generations owed to those who had fought for freedom. When his grandfather passed away 10 years earlier, James had made a promise at his funeral. He had sworn that he would always honor the memory of veterans and would never let one suffer alone if he could help it. That promise had partly inspired his decision to join the military and eventually become part of the Queen's Guard. Now, as he stood at his post, that promise echoed in his mind. Somewhere across London, an elderly veteran was lying injured and alone, just as his grandfather might have been in similar circumstances. The thought made James's chest tight with emotion, but his training kept his face expressionless. The rules for the Queen's Guard were crystal clear and had been drilled into him from day one. Under no circumstances was a guard to leave their post during duty hours. The only exceptions were medical emergencies affecting the guard himself, direct orders from a superior officer, or an immediate threat to the royal family. Personal matters, phone calls, family emergencies, none of these were considered valid reasons to abandon one's post. James had seen guards dismissed from the service for less serious infractions. Moving too much during duty, responding to tourist provocations, even adjusting their uniform without permission could result in disciplinary action. Leaving one's post entirely was considered one of the most serious offenses a guard could commit. But as the minutes ticked by, James found his resolve weakening. Every buzz of his phone seemed to be calling him to action. He imagined the old veteran lying on the cold pavement, possibly bleeding, probably scared and confused. He thought about his grandfather and wondered what the old man would have wanted him to do. The tourists continued to mill around, taking selfies and trying to get reactions from the guards. A group of school children on a field trip gathered nearby, their teacher explaining the history and significance of the Queen's Guard. James heard fragments of the lesson. These brave soldiers protect our Queen and represent the best of British military tradition. They stand here as symbols of duty, honor, and service to country. The words stung. How could he claim to represent duty and service while an old veteran suffered alone? What kind of honor was there in standing motionless while someone who had already served his country lay injured and forgotten? James's phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from his sister, who worked as a nurse in East London. "James, there's an old war vet hurt near Whitechapel Station. Nobody's helping him properly. I wish you could see what we see in the hospital. These old heroes forgotten by everyone. Makes me sick." That message hit James like a physical blow. His sister didn't even know he was already aware of the situation. The fact that she had reached out to him, knowing he was on duty and couldn't respond, showed how deeply the situation had affected her. James looked straight ahead, maintaining his position while his mind raced. His duty to the Crown was sacred, but wasn't his duty to fellow veterans equally important? The Queen herself had spent her entire life honoring veterans and military service. Would she really want him to stand idle while one of her former soldiers suffered? The weight of his decision pressed down on him like a physical force. To his left stood Sergeant Williams, a 20-year veteran of the Guards who had served in Afghanistan and Iraq. Williams was known for his strict adherence to regulations and his zero tolerance for misconduct. If James left his post, Williams would be required to report him immediately. But James also knew that Sergeant Williams had lost friends in combat. He had attended military funerals and had seen young soldiers come home broken and forgotten by the society they had served. Perhaps, just perhaps, Williams would understand. A tourist approached James, holding up a phone for a selfie. The man was middle-aged and wore an expensive suit, probably an American businessman visiting London. He smiled broadly and posed next to James, completely oblivious to the internal struggle happening behind the Guard's stoic facade. "This is so cool," the tourist said to his companion. "These guys are like robots. They'll stand here no matter what happens. Nothing can make them move." The comment felt like a challenge to James. Was that what he had become? A robot in a red tunic, programmed to follow orders without thinking or feeling. Had his training stripped away his humanity so completely that he could ignore suffering when it was within his power to help? Another buzz from his phone. This time it was a news update. War veteran still waiting for adequate medical attention. Witness reports suggest man has been on ground for over 30 minutes. 30 minutes. James closed his eyes for just a moment, breaking protocol slightly. In 30 minutes, his grandfather could have bled to death from his war wounds. In 30 minutes, a life could be lost while he stood here protecting an empty palace. The decision crystallized in his mind with sudden clarity. Years of military training had taught him to follow orders, but that same training had also taught him about courage, about doing what was right, even when it was difficult. Sometimes the greatest act of service required breaking smaller rules to uphold larger principles. James made his choice. He would leave his post, help the veteran, and face whatever consequences came afterward. His career might be over, his reputation might be destroyed, but he would be able to look at himself in the mirror. More importantly, he would be honoring the memory of his grandfather and every other veteran who had served. Now he just had to figure out how to do it without making the situation worse for everyone involved. Scattered around him, a loaf of bread, some tinned soup, a small bottle of milk that had cracked and was leaking onto the pavement. These simple items represented his survival for the week, and now they were ruined. The cut on his forehead continued to bleed, and Thomas could feel the warm liquid trickling down his temple. His old coat was torn at the elbow, and he could feel the cold seeping through to his bones. The morning that had started so normally, so routinely, had become a nightmare. As consciousness began to fade from the pain and shock, Thomas's last coherent thought was a simple one. After everything he had been through, after all the battles he had fought for his country, this was how it would end. Alone on a London street, forgotten by the very people he had once risked his life to protect. Breaking protocol. James Harrison took a deep breath and made the most difficult decision of his military career. Without any warning or announcement, he stepped away from his designated position at Buckingham Palace. His boots clicked against the pavement as he walked purposefully toward the palace gates, his red tunic and bearskin hat drawing shocked stares from tourists and confused looks from his fellow guards. Sergeant Williams immediately noticed the movement. "Harrison!" he barked, his voice cutting through the morning air. "Return to your position immediately!" But James didn't stop. He continued walking, his mind focused on one thing: getting to Whitechapel Road as quickly as possible. Behind him, he could hear the commotion as other guards scrambled to understand what was happening. Tourists began pulling out their phones, recording what they thought might be some kind of ceremony or changing of the guard. James reached the main road and did something that shocked everyone who saw it. A member of the Queen's Guard, in full ceremonial uniform, flagged down a black taxicab. The driver, a middle-aged man named Pete Collins, nearly couldn't believe his eyes when the tall soldier in the red coat opened his passenger door. "I need to get to Whitechapel Road as fast as you can drive," James said, his voice urgent but controlled. "There's a veteran in trouble." Pete had been driving London taxis for 25 years and had seen everything the city could offer, but he had never had a Queen's Guard as a passenger, especially one who appeared to be abandoning his post. The human side of Pete, however, responded to the urgency in James's voice. "Get in, mate," Pete said, already pulling into traffic. "What's happening?" As they raced through London streets, James explained the situation. Pete listened with growing anger about the attack on the elderly veteran and growing respect for the young soldier willing to risk his career to help. When they hit heavy traffic near Tower Bridge, Pete made a decision of his own. "Hold on," Pete said, turning on his hazard lights and pulling into the bus lane. "I'm not letting traffic slow us down. Not for this." 20 minutes later, they arrived at Whitechapel Road. James could see a small crowd gathered around something on the pavement. His heart sank as he realized he was looking at the aftermath of the attack. He threw a 20-pound note at Pete and ran toward the scene, his ceremonial sword bouncing at his side. Thomas Mitchell was still on the ground when James arrived. The elderly veteran was conscious but clearly in pain, his face pale and his breathing shallow. A few good Samaritans had gathered around him, including a young nurse named Sarah who was trying to keep him comfortable while waiting for the ambulance. "I'm a soldier," James announced as he knelt beside Thomas. "Let me help." The crowd parted, many of them recognizing the distinctive uniform of the Queen's Guard. James immediately began applying his military first aid training, checking Thomas for serious injuries while speaking to him in calm, reassuring tones. "What's your name?" "Sir," James asked gently. Thomas Mitchell," the old man whispered. "Private Mitchell, Royal Engineers." James felt a surge of emotion. The Royal Engineers had been his grandfather's regiment as well. "Private Mitchell, I'm Guard Harrison. I want you to know that you're not alone anymore. We're going to take care of you." Thomas looked up at the young soldier in confusion. "But you should be at the palace. You shouldn't be here." "I'm exactly where I need to be," James replied firmly. When the ambulance finally arrived, James helped the paramedics load Thomas onto a stretcher. Before they drove away, the old veteran grabbed James's hand weakly. "Thank you, son," Thomas said, tears in his eyes. Nobody has helped me in so long." "You served our country, sir," James replied. "It's my honor to serve you." As the ambulance disappeared into traffic, James realized his phone had been ringing constantly. He answered to hear the stern voice of his commanding officer, Colonel Matthews. "Harrison, return to base immediately. You are confined to quarters pending a formal disciplinary hearing." James had expected this. He took one last look at the spot where Thomas had been lying, picked up the old man's walking stick that had been forgotten in the chaos, and began the journey back to face the consequences of his actions. The disciplinary hearing was held 3 days later. James stood at attention in Colonel Matthews's office, still wearing his dress uniform but without his ceremonial weapons. Also present was Sergeant Williams and, surprisingly, a representative from Buckingham Palace. "Guard Harrison," Colonel Matthews began, "you are charged with abandonment of post, conduct unbecoming of a Queen's Guard, and bringing potential disgrace upon the regiment. How do you plead?" "Guilty to all charges, sir," James replied without hesitation. "Do you have anything to say in your defense?" James stood silent for a moment, then spoke clearly. "Sir, I would do it again. That veteran earned the right to our protection when he served in France and Germany. I couldn't stand by while he suffered alone." Colonel Matthews frowned, but before he could respond, the palace representative spoke up. "Colonel, if I may interrupt. Her Majesty has been following this situation with great interest." The room fell silent. The representative continued. "The Queen was deeply moved when she learned that one of her guards had risked his career to help a veteran in need. She feels that Guard Harrison's actions, while technically against regulations, embodied the true spirit of service that the Queen's Guard represents." Colonel Matthews looked confused. "Are you saying Her Majesty has decided that Guard Harrison's actions should be commended, not punished? She wishes to present him with a commendation for courage and compassion beyond the call of duty." James felt his knees go weak with relief and shock. The palace representative smiled. "Furthermore, the Queen has directed that Guard Harrison be promoted to corporal and assigned to lead a new initiative, the Veteran Support Program. This program will allow active guards to volunteer time helping elderly veterans in London." 2 weeks later, James visited Thomas in the hospital where the old veteran was recovering from his injuries. Thomas had suffered a fractured hip and a concussion, but doctors said he would make a full recovery. More importantly, the story of his rescue had touched people across Britain. Donations had poured in from around the country, ensuring Thomas would never have to worry about money again. "You saved my life," Thomas told James as they sat in the hospital garden. "No, sir," James replied, handing Thomas his walking stick, which he had kept safe. "You saved mine. You reminded me what it really means to serve." 6 months later, the Veteran Support Program had grown beyond anything anyone had imagined. Guards from all regiments volunteered their off-duty time to help elderly veterans with shopping, medical appointments, and simple companionship. The program became a model that was copied by military units around the world. Thomas Mitchell became the program's first official beneficiary and its most passionate advocate. Despite his age, he spent his recovered strength visiting schools and telling children about the importance of helping veterans and honoring those who served. James Harrison, now Corporal Harrison, had found his true calling. Every day after his duties at the palace, he would visit veterans around London. Sometimes he wore his uniform, sometimes regular clothes, but always he carried with him the lesson he learned that October morning, that sometimes the greatest act of service requires breaking the smallest rules. The Queen herself met with both men 6 months after the incident. She told Thomas that his service in World War II had not been forgotten, and she told James that his compassion had made her proud to be protected by the Queen's Guard. As they left the palace that day, Thomas walking steadily with his stick and James proud in his uniform, the old veteran turned to the young soldier. "You know, son, in all my years of war, I learned something important. The real enemy isn't the person shooting at you. The real enemy is indifference. The day we stop caring about each other is the day we truly lose." James nodded, understanding completely. From that day forward, neither man would ever face the world alone again. They had found in each other not just friendship, but a reminder that true heroism isn't about following rules perfectly. It's about knowing when those rules matter less than human compassion.